All right, well, why don't we get started? The worst thing is that late joiners will miss the all-important housekeeping tips. Welcome to this MIT Open Learning Digital Salon. The title you can see in front of you, Closing the Opportunity Gap from Language to Reading. My name is Jeff Dieffenbach. I'm the Associate Director of the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, MITili, and it supports institute research on effective human learning across 4 broad demographics: birth through pre-K, K-12, higher ed, and workforce. MITili is one part of the broader MIT Open Learning Initiative, which has efforts to reimagine education to better serve learners of all ages through the use of new technologies, digital tools, and applied research. I'm joined here by several colleagues from Open Learning: Yvonne, Megan, Steve, and Kate. As we're getting started, I'm going to share a few housekeeping items. First, please note that we're recording. If you prefer not to be on video, you can turn your camera off and you can ask questions in the chat window. Second, feel free to use the chat window to introduce yourself, what part of the world you're zooming in from. I'm here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, about 5 short minutes from campus, or 6 long months from campus, depending on how you count. Our intent is to follow some prepared remarks with an opportunity for Q&A with our presenters, who I'll introduce in just a minute. At any time during the session, you can use the chat box to ask any questions that you have. And feel free to, or please keep yourself on mute when not asking a question directly, which we'll have as an option during that portion of the session. These digital salons, they provide an opportunity for small groups of interested parties to engage with MIT researchers. Today, we'll be hearing from MIT Professor John Gabrieli and Harvard Postdoctoral Fellow Rachel Romeo. The Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences Professor Gabrieli's credentials are lengthy, and I will save all of us, and I suspect John the most, the trouble of going through all of them. He's the Grover Herman Professor of Health Sciences and Technology and Cognitive Neuroscience at MIT's McGovern Institute for Brain Research. And his lab, the Gabrieli Laboratory's mission, is to understand how the human brain empowers learning, thinking, and feeling, and most importantly, to use that understanding to help people live happier and more productive lives. Dr. Romeo earned her doctorate in speech and hearing bioscience and technology from Harvard University. She subsequently served as a postdoctoral fellow in both the Gabrieli Laboratory and Boston's Children's Hospital before taking her current position as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. Professor Gabrieli's and Dr. Romeo's work in part informs the 5-year Reach Every Reader project, of which Professor Gabrieli is a team lead. Reach Every Reader, a joint effort of MIT, Harvard, and Florida State University, is a collaboration with educators, families, researchers, and product developers, creating solutions to ensure that every child can unlock the wonder of words and stories. John, with that, I'll turn things over to you. And I believe you're muted, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with my collaborator, Rachel Romeo. And thank you for taking the time. I know everybody's so busy dealing with the situation we're in with this pandemic, and taking the time to attend the salon is a valuable choice on your part, and we're grateful for that. So the idea of the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, the spirit of it is that we would like to make the best of science cross that bridge from laboratory or statistical analysis or the things we do in science to make a difference in the lives of children in school and to enhance educational outcomes for all children, but especially the children who are most vulnerable to struggle in our educational system. And so we think that the science of learning, taking a scientific approach to these questions of how children can learn best and flourish best, is important in improving educational outcomes and in closing opportunity gaps. And we think the science is all the more important because of several challenges that we face. One challenge, and I'll show you some evidence for this, is there's been remarkably little progress in improving educational outcomes in general and for reading skills in particular when they're measured nationally on a national scale. So despite many years of effort by many educators and researchers, the net gains are very small, if any, and I'll share that data with you at the moment. So we need to know how to do this correctly. The usual discussions and suggestions are not working when you actually measure outcomes. Second, opportunity gaps persist. They persist largely on the basis of socioeconomic status, which is tied intimately in this country to race. And so these opportunity gaps are examples of structural racism, and addressing them is an example of anti-racism to reduce the loss of opportunity simply because you're born in an African-American family. And lastly, home learning is more important than ever during the COVID pandemic. Many children are at home, families are overwhelmed, and all learning before children arrive at school occurs at home practically anyway. So, but in this period, ways in which homes can be places where parents can help their kids get ready for school and flourish in school when school comes back is more important than ever. And so the ideas that we're going to talk about today sort of address all these things that we consider to be urgent in terms of improving outcomes for many children. So here's the evidence about all that has been done unfortunately has been ineffective in improving reading outcomes. This is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, what's called the Nation's Report Card. It's a test that's carefully structured year in, year out to be consistent across time. And here you can see that from 1995 through 2020, there's been virtually no gain in reading outcomes for children nationally in the United States. So all the efforts in educational reform, whatever else has gone on, no measurable improvements for reading for our children as a whole. So that's something that obviously we'd like to know better how we might accomplish that. Second, we think about amongst children, there's huge diversity, and one source of diversity is global income inequality. Here's a map from economists who made in purple, the United States is sort of the baseline score here. And this is not about national wealth. The United States has tremendous national wealth. It's about inequality across people in a society. And so there's this index of that, the so-called Gini coefficient. Everything, all the nations here that are in blue are nations that have less income inequality than the United States. The nations in red are greater income inequality, and there's no data available from some nations to make a determination. But as you can see, as you look at all the nations around the world, the United States has much more income inequality than neighboring Canada, than almost all of Europe, than most of Asia, than parts of Africa. Much more of the world is blue. That means they have much less income inequality. So by an objective measure of income inequality, the United States has a very high level of that, despite the great wealth that occurs in our nation overall. Now, one way of thinking about variation from child to child, from family to family in terms of economics and economic opportunity is socioeconomic status, or SES. And that's a broad concept about an individual's access to economic and social resources and all the benefits that arise from those. There are simple measurement: educational attainment, how far a parent has gone in school, income, and occupational and social prestige of jobs that parents have. So these kinds of things index, not in a complete way, and every family is different, but they give in very broad terms an estimate of socioeconomic status. And socioeconomic status, in turn, is coupled with many intercorrelated factors: chronic and toxic stress, violence exposure, nutrition, access to healthcare, exposure to toxins and pollutants, educational resources, parental caregiver availability, cognitive stimulation. All of these things in very complicated ways that differ from family to family and from place to place, but in complicated ways they're correlated with socioeconomic status. On the whole, if a child comes from a family that has less income and less educational attainment, and parents, statistically on average, they're more exposed to these sources of difficulty. And the relationship between socioeconomic status and reading outcomes is very powerful. There's been a small improvement in the opportunity gap between Black and white students in reading scores. So this is the gap, but the income gap has gone up steadily up to year 2000. It's sort of flattened out now a little bit, but it's not improved very much at all. It's very large. The zip code you're born into, the income of the house you're born into, it's a huge correlation or predictor of how well you're going to read in school. And we know reading is essential. It's the basis. We've created an educational system where reading is the vehicle for practically all of education. including math and STEM and science. Every textbook is full of words, regardless of the field that a child is studying. And here's the evidence about the power of socioeconomic status as a predictor of reading skills. This is again the NAEP. You can see that from 1998 to 2017, in red are the scores of higher income students, in blue are the scores of lower income students. A slight closing of the gap compared to 2000, but since about 2001, no closing of the gap at all. So we failed to improve reading overall. We failed to close opportunity gaps from lower income families. And we'd like to do something about this in as practical way as possible. Included in that SES gap is race, which we know is highly correlated in this nation with income and educational attainment. And this is evident data from one state, Kentucky, on these same NAEP tests, showing you the gap. So this is the performance of white children, of Black children. These numbers, this gap is the gap, the opportunity gap. And you can see that it's not closed at all. And in fact, if anything, is slightly widened. So all of this is objective evidence by the best evidence available that we need to improve outcomes for children, all children, and especially children born into conditions or situations or environments that are not conducive for reading success. And the last thing on this background perspective is we know all this, but just as a reminder that it's the end point of education in one practical way is educational attainment, how far one goes. We know that so many jobs now that are good jobs require a college degree at least. And you can see this tremendous relationship between the socioeconomic status a child is born into and the probability that they will complete college. With much greater probability if you're born into a higher SES family, much lower for a low SES family. And we want to see something occur positive educationally all the way through from when a child arrives in school to when he or she completes college, and support them for that entire arc of their educational experience and the rest of their adult life. So I think of infants as being born into a sort of neurobiological lottery. They will be born into circumstances and with genetic predispositions that will make life easier or harder for them. Reading used to be not important at all. In our history of our species, reading was not invented until about 1,000 years ago, not important until about 500 years ago, and not essential for success until about 100 years ago. So it's not in our evolutionary history, but they're born into a world where learning to read is incredibly important for doing well in school and all that comes with that. Not only in practical ways like things like income, but also in how their sense of agency, their sense of success and confidence as learners is very influenced by their experience in learning to read and how well that goes. So the overall picture that Rachel and I will share with you is that there's a very strong relationships between the experience children have with language at home before they go to school. That has a huge influence on learning to read. I mean, reading is basically spoken language made visible. So reading builds very closely upon spoken language. There's incredibly powerful relationships between those two things. Educators have a slogan, which most of us think is true, that the first few years of school from kindergarten to third grade is learning to read, getting those fundamental skills of decoding print, understanding a print. And then that in turn empowers you to read, to learn, that you will use that skill to learn everything about history, about civics, about literature and arts, about physics and chemistry. You need that reading ability to support all forms of learning as you move to the upper grades. So a study that's had a tremendous influence in our field in thinking about disparities and opportunities came from Hart and Risley, published in 1995, where they recorded at home speech for 2.5 years, 1 full hour of every word spoken at home between parents and children in 42 families. And they categorized the families into 3 groups: professional, working class, or welfare. Those are slightly older terms, but basically those are estimates of socioeconomic status. And they did something that must have been brutal on behalf of the many undergraduates and graduate students they work with. because they did not have automated devices at the time. And you'll hear from Rachel that we have a much better technology now to pursue this. They typed out every word they heard on those recordings, and then they coded every word in 30,000 pages of text, every conversational moment, every word heard by a child at home. And their core findings were these. First, that variation in the number of words they heard at home tightly linked to children's IQ and language abilities. So the more words these children heard, the better were their IQ scores and language abilities. And not only at the moment, but they predicted their academic success in many years to come in relation to how many words they heard at home. So these are long-term influences, are correlated with long-term outcomes through many years of educational experience. So this is the famous 30 million word gap. Here's the age of the child in months on the bottom. Here's the estimated cumulative number of words heard. Of course, they didn't record every moment, but they just extrapolated from their data. And they found that from children who grew up in a professional family, a high SES family to a low SES family, they estimated that by the age of 4, those children who had the luck to be born into a high income family heard 30 million more words spoken to them than those who did not. So as these children enter into kindergarten, as they begin their formal education, the children who have had less language exposure are 30 million words behind their more sort of lucky peers in this sense. And it's almost impossible in many ways, you can imagine, for a school system to make up for that early experience. I mean, maybe there's a way to do it, but as I've just shown you the statistics, everything suggests that schools cannot make up for that difference, and they don't. That's why we have persistent opportunity gaps. And so we're very interested, Rachel and I and our collaborators, in helping children so that when they arrive, they're school ready day 1 in kindergarten, to really learn the most they can and have a happy, successful educational future. Now, one thing we're very interested in, and this is a science question, but we think it's a question of ultimately of policy and practice, is this, which is very little discussed. This is, of course, although we can group people together with high or medium or low SES, there's tremendous variance. Every family is different, every adult is different, every child is different. So embedded in that broad generalization, there's tremendous variation. So here's some data. This is showing the average number of words heard, so it's good to be high for a child. This is showing you some high school, less educated families, graduated from college, more educated families. On average, there was more words heard in the families where the parents had graduated from college. But if you look at each individual circle in blue or each individual circle in green, that's an individual household. And what you can see is that there's a huge range from both lower SES and higher SES families, a huge range. SES is not destiny for this. It's statistically powerful, but it's not destiny. So here's a parent who had some high school talking so much with their child. Here's a parent who at college talking so little with their child. So one of the things we're very interested in learning is, why is this variation occur? Because if we understood that, maybe we could help all of these families be inspired and supported and encouraged and in a practical way to have many more conversations with their children. So this is just unknown. It's, Rachel and I just have discussed this many times. It's kind of mysteriously understudied and if we understood why it is, something about knowledge, something about opportunity, something about, whatever it is, maybe we could help everybody boost the language exposure of children at home. This differential language experience at home is tightly tied with vocabulary gaps and longitudinal studies. And this is work from Rachel some years ago, looking at this growing vocabulary gap between children from high and low SES families. These are statistically highly correlated with reading gaps in elementary school. So we see almost a direct line from spoken language at home to the growth of vocabulary to reading skills in later elementary years. Very powerful relations among these experiences and skills. So we're very excited to contribute to this idea that we want, all children, or so many more children, to be school ready in terms of language, so that they'll do better in school and succeed and be confident, successful learners. There's different kinds of supports that are needed at different ages. The kinds of discussions or conversations that a parent can have with an infant is, of course, so fundamentally different than with a 4-year-old on the cusp of going to pre-K or kindergarten. So it's not going to be one solution that works. We're going to have to think of a couple of them, hopefully not 50 of them, but a couple of them that are most appropriate for infants, and then others that are more appropriate for slightly older children as they migrate towards attendance of pre-K or K. And so we're very interested in understanding what it would take for us to have a practical benefit. And we think the science is terribly important on this, because if everybody knew what to do, we wouldn't have flat scores in terms of reading for the nation as a whole. We wouldn't have persistent and sometimes even widening opportunity gaps. So almost everything that people think they should be doing is probably not quite right, or at least we need the scientific evidence for what really works. And so we're super excited to try to do that, because we have some ideas that Rachel will share with you about how language experience influences children's brains, and about what direction we can go in to promote that in all children. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and Rachel will pick up this most exciting part of our presentation with you. And we look forward to your questions.
You're a tough act to follow, John, but I'll do my best.
As we're making this transition, I'll just take the opportunity to remind people, if questions come up as the talk proceeds, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll do our best to get them all answered a bit later in the presentation. Thanks.
All right, let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Can you see a screen that says, how do we reduce vocabulary gaps? All right, excellent. All right, well, I'm super happy to pick up where John left off. He laid the groundwork on a lot of the background of what motivates us to do the work we do to try and reduce these opportunity gaps and help all children thrive and succeed. And so I'm going to be presenting some of the research that we've done. I should mention I've been a member of John's lab for, oh gosh, 7, 8 years now. I did my PhD with him and postdoc, and so I can't seem to leave. So this is exciting work that we've worked on with a number of colleagues, and we're excited to share it with you, and some new ideas as well. John set up that these vocabulary and language gaps seem to be really detrimental to children's academic success. And that certainly is the case. And so what our questions are what we can do about that. And we have sort of a two-prong approach. The first is to identify modifiable early experiences that have the biggest effects on language and literacy development. So there are some things that are easier to change than others. Obviously, we're not necessarily in the business of reducing poverty itself. That's a little out of the scope of our work, but we certainly can identify aspects of children's environments that have the biggest effects, and that's what we want to try and target with our second prong, which is develop scalable intervention programs that really aim to reduce the opportunity gaps before children enter kindergarten. The early years, the 0 to 5 age range, is really the key component for brain development and school readiness. And so the gaps that children develop during that time tend to persist throughout school, no matter how high quality your school is. Your brain is really the foundation that has been set in the first 5 years. And so that's where we really want to target our intervention efforts. And so to do some of our studies, we really want to try and measure children's real world language experience. We recognize that what happens in our lab is not what happens in the real world. And so unlike Hart and Risley, who spent, had God knows what kind of army of research assistants, we use a technology, a modern day technology called LENA. It stands for Language Environment Analysis, and it's a small digital recorder that sits inside of a pocket on specially made clothing, and children can wear it all day. And It records a full day of audio from their perspective. Because it's on the child's person, it records everything from first person perspective. And then when children and families return the audio recorders to us, we have computer algorithms that process the audio and segment it out and tell us an estimate of how many words the child heard spoken by an adult in their environment during the day, the number of utterances the child themselves made, how many times they vocalized, and then critically, the number of times there was a back and forth. So we call these conversational turns anytime an adult speaks and a child responds, or vice versa, a child speaks and an adult responds. We call that a conversational turn. And so hopefully by the end of today, I'll convince you that these are really where the important language experience is. And so we take these measures we get from children's real world language experience, and then we try and relate it to measures of their development. And what we find first is that we see this socioeconomic gap. We see a really strong relationship in our studies, like Hart and Risley did, between socioeconomic status, or SES, and children's language experience. So you can see that here in these scatter plots. Children from higher SES families towards the right of the plots tend to hear more words and conversational turns. But what's really exciting to us is that when we statistically control for SES and essentially put everyone on the same SES level, we see that children's scores on standardized language assessments are not associated with the number of words they hear, but they are associated with the number of conversational turns that they experience. So in other words, no matter a family's SES, a child's experience with conversational turns is related to their language development. And our next step was to try and understand, so we've got these relationships between experience and cognitive development, but we really want to know how this plays out at the neural level to see if conversational turns are also related to brain development and that brain foundation. And so to do this, we need to measure children's brain responses to language. And to do that, we have children lie in an MRI scanner. And so you can see some images here of our child MRI lab, where we bring children in, we get them used to a pretend scanner first, and they get used to going inside an MRI scanner, how to lie still. We play games with them to make sure they know how to lie still and not move their body, so we get clear images. And then we can play them sounds or show them pictures and track their brain activity. And so what we do for this particular study is we play them short stories, about 15 seconds, both forwards and backwards, to measure the response to language. And so here's an example of a story they would have heard. And let me know if you can't hear it.
Tim and his friend were playing hide and seek. Tim hid in the closet, but then he sneezed. His friend quickly found him. Tim asked if he could hide again, and his friend started counting. This time, it took a long time to find Tim.
So these are stories that preschoolers were the age of children in this specific study, things they're familiar with, playing games, those types of things. And then we would, and what we see is when we play them these stories, we see large areas of the brain that are activated. Those are the regions you see colored. So these are brain regions that are involved in language processing, but they're also regions of the brain that are involved in hearing any sound or processing the fact that you're sitting inside of an MRI scanner that's making loud noises. And so what we also have to do is play them something else to control for that. And so we played the same stories backwards, and that sounds a little bit like this. So you can tell that's speech, but it has no meaning. So what it does is it activates similar but non-overlapping brain regions. And so you can see that in this picture here. And then what we do is just a very simple subtraction. So we subtract the activation to the backward speech from the activation to the forward speech. And what this gives us are the brain regions that are really responsible for that higher level language processing. And so this is how we can index how children are processing language at the neural level. And what we aim to do is see how that brain activation relates to children's language experience. And what we see is that similar to our behavioral results, we didn't find any relationship between the sheer number of adult words children experience and their brain processing of language, but we do see a significant correlation between the number of conversational turns and activation in what a region we call Broca's area. It's in the left frontal cortex, so it's right above your left temple. And this is a region crucially involved in language. So both understanding language, producing language, interacting with language. And so you can see that relationship played out in the scatter plot. The children who are experiencing more conversational turns are exhibiting more activation in Broca's area when processing language. And with correlations like this, I really like to illustrate that on an individual level. So these 2 dots I've circled in green are 2 individual children, and I'm going to show you what their brains look like. So here are 2 5-year-old girls. They're both from lower SES backgrounds, matched on SES. And the girl on the right experienced more than twice the conversational turns of the girl on the left. And so you can see that they both exhibit extensive activation in this temporal lobe region. So that's the really the area of the brain that processes low-level auditory processing, that says you're hearing something, I recognize that it sounds, and maybe I recognize that it's speech. And where we really see the difference, though, is in the frontal lobe, and that's where we have this higher level language processing. And this is where we see that more conversational turns are related to greater activation. And I think the really crucial part of this is then what that means for language development. And so what happens is these brain differences actually relate to differences in the verbal scores, the scores on language assessments and how children understand and process language. So we give children a number of verbal assessments to understand their vocabulary, their grammar, their command of the language. And the mean of these assessments in the broader population, much like an IQ test, is 100. So the girl on the left is in sort of the low average range, while the girl on the right is doing well above average. So even though she's from a low SES background, thanks to her environment, her very rich verbal environment, she's beating the odds and well above average. And so we've also done a couple of studies to try and see not just brain activation, but also physical brain structure. And how that relates to conversational experience. And so these images depict the strength of white matter connection. So these are what I like to refer to as sort of the information highways of the brain that take information from one region to another. And we see that the strength of these connections is represented by the colors. So these are our same 2 girls. One who has more conversational turns than the other. And you can see that the girl who experiences fewer turns has weaker connections or more blue, specifically in this pathway that connects 2 key language regions. So that auditory, very low level language region to the high level Broca's area language region. While the girl with the more conversational turns has stronger connections or more red and yellow. So putting these studies together, we can really see the role of conversational turn taking on both the function and structure of children's brains, especially in regions related to language development. And so I hinted at our second question. These studies are very nice. We've demonstrated that conversational turn taking is related to brain development, but so what? So how do we fix it? If conversational turns are so important for brain development, can we develop interventions to increase children's turn-taking exposure? And by way of doing that, can we induce neuroplasticity that really supports optimal development? And to investigate that question, we've so far done 1 pilot study, but we're hoping to do more. So in our first pilot study, we used a family-centered intervention, and we used a a method called randomized control trial with lower SES families. And what that means is we take a group of families, we had 50 of them, and we randomly assign them to either an intervention group or a control group. The control group continues business as usual, while the intervention group participates in a family-based intervention. And so what this consisted of was a small group, family-based small groups over the course of 9 weeks. They had weekly sessions for 2 hours, and parents would meet in a small group about 4 to 5, and then there'd be a separate activity for children. And I won't dive too much into detail on the curriculum, but it involved several aspects. It involved a lot of aspects related to parenting, but there were some specific modules focused on using what was called meaningful language. And so that incorporates aspects of responsiveness, increased turn taking, ideas of trying to balance out your turns. So don't just talk all the time at your child, but really wait for your child to respond and try and make sure there's a balance. And using questions to continue conversation. So it doesn't end, but it keeps going. But really importantly, it didn't instruct families just to talk more. You know, it's not about just getting more words in, but rather to have more awareness to make the communication you're already engaging in more quality. So harness the strengths you already have. And what we saw, and this is hot off the presses. In fact, it's not even on the presses yet. You're getting the first look at this data. We've just been working on the paper right now. And so what we see is that our intervention group shows a greater increase in their conversational turns than our control group. So we do see a group effect based on conversational turns. So we were able to increase their conversational turns. And then excitingly, there's a relationship between how much they increase in conversational turns and how much children's language scores change. So in other words, children who are experiencing the greatest increase in conversational turn taking are also showing a greater increase in their language scores. And we really see this effect driven by children in the intervention group. So of course, our main question is, if we're moving language, we're moving conversational turns, did we change the brain? And this is the thing I'm super excited to show you. The answer is yes. We saw that there is a relationship between how much conversational turn change occurs and physical thickening of the cortex. So this is the gray matter in your brain that actually does all the processing and does all the stuff. And so we see cortical thickening in 2 main brain regions. The first is in the front part of the brain. It includes Broca's area, but it's not just Broca's area. It extends a bit further into the prefrontal cortex in regions we know to be involved in things like executive functioning and cognitive control. And you may have heard of these skills. They're critical school readiness skills that highly predict academic success: ability to track a speaker, ability to drown out information that is irrelevant, such as disruptive peers, and really focus and apply yourself and switch your attention. And we also see changes in conversational turns are related with thickening in a region towards the back of the brain, in a region called the temporoparietal junction. And this is a region that's highly involved in social processing. So things like theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other people have different thoughts than you do. So growth in this region may be related more to the social aspects of conversation. So we kind of see this really interesting complete picture where conversational turns seem to be related not just to language and language-related brain development, but also development of other regions related to executive functioning and perhaps the social aspects of communication. And we think that the relationships between all of these cognitive domains and how conversational turns may feed into not just language, but all sorts of school readiness skills. I think that's a really interesting and exciting area for future study. And I want to leave you just with an exciting idea of some work that we've been thinking about with our colleagues to do. And this is a screenshot from an intervention program that some of our colleagues have developed called the READY intervention, Ready for Kindergarten. And it stands for different types. The R, E, A, and D all stand for different types of language you can use with your children, thinking about the past and the future, asking questions and explanations. And then the Y is a piece that refers to self-efficacy. And this is not trivial. It's reminding parents that you are your child's first and best teacher, and you can make a difference. And a lot of parents struggle with the idea that, well, I'm not that smart. I can't do anything to help train my child. You know, their teachers will do that. But this is really enculturating the idea that you can make a difference. And so our colleagues have done a pilot study of this intervention with high SES families delivered in person, and they see that it does increase the amount of conversational turns that occur in the training group versus a control group. And so we think a really crucial idea, especially for the time we're in right now, is to adapt this to be a completely virtual phenomenon. So this intervention, even though it was delivered in person, it's actually based on a very brief 15-minute video that explains these concepts. And so we think we can adapt that to a virtual environment and reach a very large number of low SES families and sort of bring this to the masses during a time that's really, we're seeing opportunity gaps widen bigger and bigger than they already were. And so these are some of our questions we'd love to explore, extend this work into the future. Pertinent to right now, as I mentioned, can we use virtual interventions during the COVID pandemic to help ameliorate some of these widening opportunity gaps? And then some more science questions, sort of looking at the beyond of right now. If we do these conversational turn interventions in infancy and preschool, do we see these opportunity gaps decreased at kindergarten entry? So right now we're seeing huge gaps in children's school readiness the first day they show up at kindergarten. So can we reduce some of these gaps right at the starting of school? And then finally, if we do some of these interventions early on when the brain is most plastic, do the effects persist all the way through schooling? And can we see some of these effects on reading and literacy and learning of all sorts of different things? And so those are some questions I'll leave you with. And now it's your turn. We'll open it up for you to ask us any questions, and we're happy to answer. Thanks.
This will become the conversational turns piece of the session. We've got a couple that are in the chat session, and a few have been submitted by attendees in advance, and I'll go back and forth between them. If there are questions that we don't get to, we'll try to get answers to those after the fact. A couple of questions on the theme of adults. This is one that was submitted in advance, and it's a two-parter, so I'll give you both parts. How can educators or even healthcare professionals model this for parents? And then two, how might this apply for early childcare providers?
I'll take a shot at that. I think these are models that could work, because everything that Rachel described in the READY program, for example, they're very specific. You talk about recent events, instead of the current moment, talk about future hopes and wishes and fears, things like that. Wait, for a moment for people to talk for an infant or a child to talk back with you, so you have a real back and forth conversation. So I think the principles are widely applicable. The thing that really matters, I think, is how these things are executed, because we've had many principles in education that many parents are told, many teachers are told, but we have to know if they really work, as they're truly executed, not just a sort of a wish, but it really works. It's kind of like we're waiting for the vaccine for the pandemic. We want one that really works. And so, we think that if we know that this really works, and what level, for example, of information somebody needs, they need just a little bit of information. Is one video enough? Things like this. We need to know that scientifically, I think, Otherwise, you know, it falls into me. I get in my email, because of the field I'm in, I get, you know, 50 emails a day, just about, with all kinds of suggestions for parents and teachers. And all of them make kind of sense. But if many of them were terrific, we wouldn't have opportunity gaps, we wouldn't have a flat line in terms of reading skill. So there's something about the translation of good intentions to an effective form, and nothing beats that than, you know, careful science, to know what that is. And then of course it's incredibly important, you know, to share that with educators, with parents in effective ways. But if we don't know for sure that something works and enough about how it works, then we're likely just to go on the way we're doing, which is, you know, lots of good intentions, lots of care, but without real knowledge. You know, I think we want the kind of knowledge for these things that are just as important as, for example, medical care for a child. And there, we wouldn't just tell parents, you know, do what you think is best. Good luck. We know everybody has good intention. You know, if there's a thing to be helped for a child, you know, parents want somebody with real expertise to give them the information that they can count on. And I think in the same way, we want that kind of science to drive this. But then, you know, these kinds of interventions are, you know, as Rachel described, what people call light touch, a short video, occasional maybe phone reminders we all can use that for just about everything we do. And if we can show that that's enough to make a difference for a child, you know, then I think clinicians, nurses, teachers, daycare providers, you know, we could make a huge effort to extend that knowledge to everybody.
I agree with you so much, John. And I love the analogy to the medical field. I actually use a term with some of my colleagues over at the hospital. We call it language nutrition, that you're, you know, providing nutrition for the brain and for brain development. And I think one reason I mean, I know everyone thinks they have like the magic bullet and, you know, conversational turns, maybe it can seem like it's just another one of those things, but I think one of the things that really sets it apart and that I love about it is that it's something you're already doing. We're not trying to teach parents how to do something novel or new, or, you know, I know probably a lot of families right now are trying to learn their child's curriculum so they can teach them something new. But this is something you're already doing. And conversational turns, they evolve over a child's lifetime, right? It's something, I mean, these studies we did with preschoolers, so you can actually have a what we'd consider a conversation with a preschooler, but we can use the same terms to discuss a conversation with an infant. You know, you can trade funny faces back and forth, and you're turn taking right there. You can trade sounds, you know, or just single words back and forth, and that's turn taking. And so it really extends. It's a broader perspective than just, you know, dumping language into a child's brain. It seems to be bigger than that, and I think it's still an open question of how to best design these interventions. You know, is a light touch enough? And then beyond that, at what age and in what way? You know, the brain is more plastic early on. So should we be doing these things when you know, kids are infants, or you know, are preschoolers too old? Are elementary students too old? I'd like to believe not, that you just adapt the intervention for the people you're working with.
That leads really perfectly into one of the questions in the chat, which again is adult focused, and it asks about whether there have been studies of the number of spoken words or vocabulary or conversational turns on the part of a teacher, where the difference isn't so much, as I'm reading it, the teacher's SES, but rather the SES of the classroom. Somebody from a school in a better zip code or a wealthier zip code. And so I wonder, is there work that's been done in that area? Actually, I don't wonder so much as one of our commenters wondered.
Yeah, so that's an area that I don't have that great expertise in, I must say. So I don't have a for sure answer on that at all. I'd say two things, you know, broadly on this. One of them is it's got to make a difference, you know, what a teacher can do with a child depending on how school ready the child is. And so, you know, all these things will be heavily correlated. The other thing is, you know, I think the preparation and professional development of early school teachers has not been, I think, as strong as it could be. But again, I'll say, because it's very different. A high school teacher who teaches algebra, you want them to be a nice teacher, but if they know algebra really well, that's half the battle. There's an intuition that, like, what skill do you really need, for a 5-year-old? Like, anybody can teach them, right? And I know a lot of people don't hold that view, but I think that happens a lot. And so I think the professional development of early educators, and maybe exactly along these lines we're talking about today. But at the moment, a lot of that professional education is not based on any scientific evidence. It's based on intuitions and good wishes, which are really great. But if we were right that this use of this ready approach to promoting language helps a child grow, then that would be great to teach all teachers to make sure they're doing that. But we'd like the evidence that it really works, so that it's not just another program, but one that has proven efficacy on behalf of children.
Yeah, I know there are studies, some ongoing, using Lena in classrooms, trying to understand how teachers communicate with children. I don't have any explicit results. They're not studies I'm doing, so I don't know have any results to share with you. But I think, it in general, it tends to follow the principle that more wealthy or highly resourced schools tend to often get the best teachers, and we can see those opportunity gaps in language in the classroom. I think there's certainly something to be said for educating teachers better to on these types of strategies, and I think that is certainly a promising strategy, not one that I've tested myself, but I think there's certainly something to be said for that. But I also think if you want the biggest bang for your buck, earlier tends to be better. I like to think of it like building a house on a foundation. If the foundation is shaky, you can build the best house you want, but it's still risky, right? It's still not on solid ground. So if you build that brain foundation early on, before a child even arrives at school, then you've really primed them for learning. And in fact, we believe that with testing these interventions during that early time period, we can really have the biggest get the most out of it, biggest bang for our buck.
So John and Rachel, I may have set the two of you up just a little bit in the session description, where I pulled some language from the Reach Every Reader description, which is ensuring that every child can unlock the wonder of words and stories. And one of our audience members in an advanced question asked, what are your thoughts on this mission, and specifically the every, right? It gets to the question of scale. How do we take this to scale?
So I think the scaling thing is really important, in a practical way. And so that's what, we're really, for all the Zoom fatigue that many have, I think that there's been some real lessons learned about where Zoom, where that kind of internet communication can be extremely powerful. So just to pick something a little bit different, but to give us hope, there's been several studies that were run before COVID, showing, for example, that behavioral therapy for psychological challenges is equally effective with Zoom therapists as it is with in-person therapists. And if we would think, if anything requires two people in a room to quietly communicate effectively, it would be something in terms of mental health therapy. But several studies have been published now, just in the last couple of months, showing that there's no difference at all in terms of efficacy, in terms of the benefit for the patient. So knowing that, one lesson we're learning is that for some things, internet kinds of supports or communications or apps can be phenomenally effective. And so the idea that Rachel talked about with our collaborators at Harvard of having just a video and some phone reminders, that's very scalable, both at home and at school. And so we're very excited about a highly scalable thing. And as Rachel pointed out really nicely in her research, the evidence is so striking, both in the brain and in behavior, that this lever is available for all parents. That the more conversations that occur helps the child's vocabulary and helps the child's brain development, whether the family has a high income or low income. So it's, we know that some families are in very difficult situations, and we respect that. but the benefits are true at every income level. So a highly scalable program that, as Rachel mentions, builds on things that occur kind of naturally, parents talking with their kids, seems to us a really promising path to really greatly widening educational opportunity for children.
And if I can just add one little piece on that, I think John's absolutely right that, you know, our research thus far is showing the real power of conversational turns for everyone. And certainly we're right now we've taken a quantitative approach, right? We're measuring the number of conversational turns. But, you know, especially low resource families are perhaps limited in the time they can spend face-to-face with their child. Or, you know, there's many other stressors and lack of resources that maybe can diminish the quantity of turns they might be able to engage in. And so an open area of exploration that we're working on is not just looking at the quantity of turns, but also the quality of turns. You know, could it be the case that you don't have to reach a certain, you know, quota of your turns like you do on your Fitbit with your steps, but rather, you know, if you get so many high quality turns in a day, it's the same as, you know, a ton of lower quality turns. So this is absolutely an avenue of open exploration. And I think that can absolutely help to answer the question of how do we actually reach everyone? You know, is there something within this scope of conversational turns that it makes it more accessible to even folks who have more restricted time?
I'm going to tie together one question from the chat with one that we received in advance, and noting that we've got just a couple minutes left. I'll do then a very quick wrap up after that. But in the chat, the question was asked about the role of emotion, which actually comes into play in a question asked in advance, which is, in the absence of this kind of conversation with parents or family members or caregivers, what about social robots that might be able to have this kind of interactivity with probably a different emotion, but potentially still some impact? Any guesses?
You know, Rachel showed beautifully that conversations are not only about language, but they're about relations between a parent and a child, and the growth of the social brain, as well as the language thinking brain. And so it is true that that's a big, the two go together. That's what makes conversation so powerful. We have a colleague, Cynthia Brazil, who's been working on social robots. You know, I think that's another very interesting direction to go. Everybody's afraid that technology, you know, harms child development in various ways. You know, unfortunately, it turns out that plunking your child in front of a TV, you know, is a lifesaver sometimes under difficult circumstances, but the lack of back and forth conversation makes it not a rich language experience for the child. Could technology accomplish that? You know, it seems like every day gets a little better. And I think we're really interested in pursuing that scientifically as well, because there'll be some families in some situations, you know, as Rachel said, where families are just so afflicted by their environment, you know, that they can't turn to this for whatever reason. So, you know, that's worth a pilot study as well. But I can tell you, my children enjoy teasing, you know, Siri and Alexa into ridiculous errors. I think which shows that we're not, you know, it's not going to be a Siri or Alexa level. It's going to be something that involves some element of not quite yet accomplished artificial intelligence for language back and forth communication. But that it could certainly be something that would be extremely scalable and valuable for children. We're not there yet, but it's something to look at.
That's great. And I think you made the point earlier that in conversational turns, you're looking not just at parent then child, but also child then parent. And I could imagine that initiation of a conversation by a child with Siri, even in the playful way that you've observed, is powerful. It didn't have to be the prompt coming from the adult. John and Rachel, thanks so much for your time, and to our audience for your time as well. We welcome everyone to stay connected, to hear more about ongoing research, progress, activities that we've going on. We certainly invite people to consider supporting MITili financially with a contribution to further our efforts in human learning effectiveness research of the sort that you've heard about today. We'll share the recording. I know there was at least one question in the chat that we didn't get to. We'll share an answer for that as well. And again, thanks for a fascinating session. there's so much that we can learn from our 4 to 6-year-olds.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.